Recently, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro had a debate with Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks. In the debate, they began talking about the culture war or culture wars, and Ben Shapiro identified systemic racism as being the key issue at the heart of the culture war, the sort of linchpin that holds together the left's entire worldview, something I agree with. He also astutely identified the dual identity of systemic racism, the sort of Mott and Bailey tactic that leftists often use when debating this topic. The Mott being that institutions in America are systemically racist and oppressing people of color on a daily basis. The Bailey being that socioeconomic disparities are largely a product of historic oppression.
I'm positive that, elementary schools are not learning about systemic racism. And even if they are, even if it's a boiled down version of that, learning about systemic racism is important. I think that that's something that's an issue in this country that gets ignored or completely denied. And I think that's wrong. I think that's what also leads to the division that we're experiencing.
Well, that's going to be the major culture war issue, right? Because the fact is that I, as a parent, believe that if you're going to teach...
You think there's no systemic racism?
I believe that it depends on how you define systemic racism. So if you're talking about legal regimens of racism, no. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about history has after effects, of course. So I think there's a real problem with semantic overload in a lot of our political conversations. And when people say systemic racism, sometimes what they mean by systemic racism is history has consequences. You can't have 150 years of, 300 years of slavery followed by Jim Crow and that not have after effects, which of course is true. And sometimes what they mean is that every inequality in American public life is due to some systemic inequity that is currently taking place in the United States, which I think is absolutely 100% false.
The only thing missing from Ben's observation is that, in my personal experience, it seems to be the same person who is using both of those two different definitions, talking out both sides of their mouths in classic leftist fashion. A common example when you're watching a debate on systemic racism is to see the progressive launch with an attack on the justice system, claiming that the system treats people of color unfairly. But if the progressive finds themselves up against an adept opponent, somebody like Sean Last, who can use their own favorite weapon of peer-reviewed studies against them to illustrate that there really is no unfair treatment in the criminal justice system at a systemic level, the progressive, now backed into a corner, will often end up saying, well, the real problem is that people of color commit more crime. They commit more crime because they're poor, and they're poor because of historic oppression. Even if we accept those things as being true, it's a lot different than the initial position they started out with, which is that the criminal justice system has a problem due to a bunch of people inside the system having prejudice towards people of color. It's not my intention today to try to tear down the Bailey of generational wealth, although I do think there are many ways that one could poke holes in even those arguments. What I want to talk about today is another institution other than the criminal justice system, which often gets brought up in these conversations, although not quite as often, and that is the education system. The progressive framing of the education system is not as nefarious as the justice system, but still quite pernicious. They will essentially argue that public schools are funded based off of local property taxes, and since white neighborhoods are wealthier than Black and Latino neighborhoods, white schools have more funding than Black and Latino schools, which allows white students to receive a better quality of education, which allows the white students to achieve higher levels of educational attainment, and then go on to have higher income, etc. in life. I was watching a Vosh debate the other day on systemic racism, so don't take my word for it. Here it is, straight from the horse lover's mouth.
Here in the United States, a lot of social damage is done from the disparity between Black and white people, not just from Black people being poor, but from the fact that there's a dissonance socially between those two groups. It leads to a lot of social infighting, a lot of bitterness and resentment. It leads to certain parts of our cities being underkempt, certain parts of our educational systems underfunded. And it means that there's going to be a permanent racial bias to the workplace distribution in these cities because, if all the worst schools are in Black neighborhoods and the best ones are in white neighborhoods, Black families have less money than white families on average. of course the white people are going to get the tech job education. It has nothing to do with any individual teacher being racist. They could have affirmative action programs if they wanted. It wouldn't change all the underlying mathematics. Likewise, there are changes that we can make to the funding of school districts. The fact that schools are funded based on the property taxes of the houses in that district, that perpetuates a lot of problems. Because, I mean, if you live in a super wealthy neighborhood, your school does not need like that much money. It just doesn't. It's not contributing to the education. Past a certain point, you're just buying. I know this. I grew up in Beverly Hills. We had a brand new science.
I've not heard of that place.
Yes. We had a brand new science building, and then they built the new football thing, and our gym had a basketball court that turned into a pool because the floor opened like the Red Sea. It was
sheer opulence.
And I'm only right next to Koreatown. There are kids who had to grow up in the Los Angeles school district, and their schools were just these. I mean, I don't want to be too evocative or anything, but the distribution of wealth as it stands right now was entirely superfluous in my neighborhood, and it was very destructive to the lives of many other people. Stuff like that.
And so today we're going to examine the two premises that conclusion of systemic racism is built on. The first being that white schools are significantly more funded than black schools as a result of property taxes, and the second being that these disparities in funding have a strong causal effect on educational attainment. It's the iHypocrite deep dive on education. Let's get right into it. The notion that schools are primarily funded based off of property taxes and that this results in large racial disparities in the quality of schooling is a common one, which is surprising given that it hasn't really been that way since about 1960. Here I'm showing you a chart which shows the sources of funding for public schools in the United States from 1890 to 2010. Obviously, we're missing the most recent 11 years of data here, but the trends haven't really changed. The yellow area on the chart is local funding, the green area is state funding, and the blue area is federal/unassigned, which would refer to things like philanthropic grants from people like Bill Gates. And so while it's true that the local funding, the yellow area, goes to the schools where those property taxes are being paid, the state and federal funding is a lot more discretionary, and it ends up being funneled towards the underprivileged students in order to even out the playing field. And this has been happening for a long time. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Title IX, a federal civil rights law implemented in 1972 to prohibit discrimination in public school on the basis of sex. The reason you're probably familiar with it is because it got talked a lot about over the last few years as there were some tweaks and changes made to it, allowing and then unallowing schools to kick out boys who are accused of sexual assault without any kind of due process. And it also comes up from time to time with transgendered students playing sports. But what I wanted to know is who here is familiar with Title I, the OG title? Title I is not a civil rights law, but rather a federally funded program designed to help students who need extra support in school. Funds are given to each school district dependent upon the number of low-income families in the district. It was implemented in 1965 by Lyndon B. Johnson. The state funding, which comes from income taxes, sales tax, and other fees, also tends to be funneled towards the students in need in order to make sure that all schools are providing an adequate education. This is demonstrated quite clearly in a 2019 study titled Pathways to Inequality Between District Segregation and Racial Disparities in School District Expenditures, which found that on average, across the entirety of the United States, Black students receive $229 more per per student than white students, and Latino students receive $126 more per student on average. I'm sure that's a bit surprising for most people, so I'll say it again. Black and Latino students receive more funding than white students in the United States of America. Something I find particularly interesting about this is that, of course, income tax will make up a big part of that on both the state and federal level. And since white people have higher incomes on average than black people, that would mean that white people are paying more into the public education funding than they're getting out, while the black and Latinos are getting out more than they're putting in. And what's especially illuminating about this is that I would submit to you that if you were to survey white people and ask them how they feel about that, they would tell you that they're happy about it, that they think that that money should go where it is needed in order to provide equal opportunities for everyone. So just to recap the funding scenario, you have money being taken from white people, given to students of color, and the white people, as I've noted, are mostly happy to help. And then you have progressives like Vosh looking at this system and saying, this is racist against the black and Latino people. This is the whole system is racist. So as I said earlier, I want to look at the actual effects that funding has on education. If you drastically increase the funding of a school, do you see drastic changes in the test scores of the students? Are those students more likely to end up with college degrees, et cetera, et cetera? But before we get to that, I have to admit that working on the first segment, I became really curious about the disparity between reality and people like Vosh's view of reality. How did we get to this state? And while I don't think it's worthwhile to spend a great deal of effort trying to reverse engineer Vosh's thought process, I did do a little Google foo to try to see where are these talking points coming from? Where is this information coming from? And while there is a variety of sources, one source in particular seemed to come up over and over and over and over, and that source is NPR. I guess it really shouldn't come as a surprise. I remember when Vosh and Destiny debated in person on the Modern Day Debate channel, and everybody was all hyped for that because they had had such heated exchanges online, but the conversation ended up being a very boring circle jerk about how socialism could fix America's problems, and I described it at the time as like listening to a boring episode of an NPR podcast minus the expertise. And these NPR articles seem to be highly favored by the Google search algorithms. Just to give you a rough idea, I tried doing a Google search for, do public high schools pay rent and property taxes? And the number one result that comes up for that search is the NPR article, Why America's Schools Have a Money Problem, which does not address that query at all. What it does do is start off with a very long and detailed anecdote about two different schools in Chicago that have a very large disparity between the per student average yearly funding. And while I'll go ahead and give them the benefit of the doubt that their figures are correct, although we'll see later that maybe we shouldn't give them that, what you won't learn from reading this article is that Illinois has one of the least progressive public school funding systems in the country. They only get about 25% of their funding from the state, which can then allow for large disparities between really wealthy neighborhoods and really poor neighborhoods to persist since the state isn't making up the difference. And so while it can be fair to criticize that if you're a big proponent of this idea that all schools should have the same funding, which isn't the worst progressive idea I've ever heard, if I'm being honest, it is very misleading to act like this is representative of the country at large, because it's much more the exception than the rule. In fact, it's so misrepresentative of the big picture that I'm sure if a conservative outlet were publishing articles like this, they would get fact-checked on Facebook as misleading and missing context. And in case you didn't know, the point of Facebook fact checking isn't just to add the additional information onto the post. It's actually to punish the people who are making the posts so that they have less reach. I have a very good detailed video on that called Fact Checkers you can check out if you want. But there's an even more egregious NPR article on this topic that will come up high in the Google results if you're looking for this kind of information, and it's titled "Why White School Districts Have So Much More Money." This article was published in 2019, the same year as the study we looked at earlier, and in this article, NPR is presenting a report from a nonprofit organization called Edbuild, which claims that white kids get $23 billion more in education funding in the States than non-white kids, or as it breaks down, and this is straight from the NPR article quoting the report, it says, for every student enrolled, the average non-white school district receives $2,226 less than a white school district. Now, again, this is the same year as the study we looked at previously, and it is a wildly different result. Obviously, both of those things can't be true at the same time. So how did this happen? First of all, to understand what they mean when they say white versus non-white, in order to be counted as a white district, the students have to be greater than 75% white. And in order to be counted as a non-white district, the students have to be greater than 75% non-white. That means any district that didn't meet that 75% threshold of either white or non-white students was excluded from the analysis. They then created 4 additional categories, which were white districts with high poverty, white districts with low poverty, and non-white districts with high poverty and non-white districts with low poverty. Now, to give an idea of the kind of exclusion that this creates, they excluded state-level analysis on any states that didn't have at least 2% of the total enrollment in each category. 2% is a fairly low threshold, so there must be a lot of districts that don't fit into these categories. Now, I'm not saying this is all nefarious or anything. I'm just saying that these results, again, like the other NPR article, might be more on the fringe side and not nationally representative. But something I found more dubious when I skimmed through the methodology is the first thing they put under revenue calculations, which is that all of the figures are cost adjusted to convert for variation in the purchasing power of a dollar across different regions. Now, they don't go into a whole lot of detail about what that actually means, and maybe I'm just too low IQ to understand, but it kind of sounds like they're saying that they adjust the amount of revenue based off of the cost of living of the region. And if that's the case, it seems like something that would favor them getting the kind of result they want. Just for example, I tried to look up whether teachers in urban areas earn higher salaries than teachers in suburban or rural areas. And according to topeducationdegrees.org, which cites multiple sources, there is no real difference in the salaries between rural, suburban, or urban areas for school staff. Obviously, paying staff salaries isn't the only operating cost that a school has, but it is a fairly large slice of the pie. And so you can see based off that, if they're counting the urban dollars, which is where the minority students are going to predominantly be, as having less value, even though the salary costs are the same, it seems like the kind of numbers massaging that you would do to get the result you want rather than being a really logical, defensible decision. But maybe I'm just not understanding the whole thing. If somebody can explain it better, please sound off in the comments section. But looking at all the other ways that they massage the numbers, I knew that I couldn't be the only person questioning this report. So I looked it up and sure enough, came to an article in Tucson Weekly titled, "How Did Edbuild Get Arizona's Per Student Funding Numbers So Wrong?" This article is written by David Safier, a retired teacher and writer whose eyebrows were raised by the Edbuild report when he saw that they ranked Arizona as having the biggest discrepancy between white and non-white students, a $7,600 difference. He knew this was wrong, so he looked into it, even going as far as contacting the Edbuild CEO, and what he confirmed through his investigation is that they weight a district the same regardless of the number of students it has. And so if if you have some small rural area where they have a school with like 100 students, it's likely that that's going to be a predominantly white area and that the funding is going to be higher because it costs more for smaller schools. Even though you have a low amount of students, you still need to pay teachers, administrators, janitors, IT people, nurses, etc., etc., etc. In his article, David Safier shows that the results are wildly different when you actually take the number of students in the district into account, which Edbuild did not do. Of course, I'll link all these sources in the description if you want to look closer for yourself. But what's telling is that going back to the NPR article, of course, there are no updates there, no notices about the figures being disputed or anything. NPR presents the Edbuild report, which I'll also mention is a report, not a peer-reviewed study like the one that I showed. If you're the kind of person to put weight on peer review, I do less and less so myself these days. I don't think peer review matters that much, if I'm being honest. That's why you have to look at the methodologies to see what's going on for yourself. But point is, NPR presents the report as absolute fact. So looking at all this stuff, we are able to get a picture of how these liberal types wind up believing the things that they believe. And it's because they're told those things are true from sources that they consider to be very reliable.
And the other thing we should do is we should challenge these students. We should challenge students in these schools to have advanced placement programs in these schools. We have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids, wealthy kids, black kids, Asian kids. No, I really mean it, but think how we think about it.
Today, we're going to be looking at the other side of this misconception, which is the very notion that by increasing funding, we can have a serious impact on students who underperform and possibly even eliminate existing achievement disparities between different racial groups. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The first thing I want to note is that if you zoom out and look at national education expenditures compared to learning outcomes, you'll see that the correlation is fairly weak. Countries like the United States and Luxembourg have very high per student expenditures with average results, while countries like Russia, Vietnam, South Korea, etc. have significantly lower expenditures while achieving results that are similar, or in the case of South Korea, significantly better. The other thing you'll notice is that on the left side of the graph, some countries do come in quite low on the outcomes axis, the y-axis, which means that if we were to plot the correlation linearly, it would look sort of like a hockey stick, sort of like this. Here's an example of similar data with the trends plotted there. And so the takeaway would be that there's a minimum threshold of expenditure that you need to provide an adequate education. But once you've met that minimum threshold, continuing to adding more funding doesn't really produce significant results in terms of the outcomes. Another thing I want to quickly mention before we really get into the weeds is the philanthropic endeavors by people like Bill Gates. In part one of the series, I briefly mentioned this article from 2017. Bill Gates is spending $1.7 billion to fix the U.S. education system, which notes a specific focus on inequality. Melinda and I made public education our top priority in the U.S. because we wanted to do something about the disparity in achievement and post-secondary success for students of color and low-income students. An update was posted in 2020 with the headline, Bill and Melinda Gates have spent billions trying to fix U.S. public education, but say it's not having the impact they want. In their 2020 newsletter, Bill and Melinda Gates said that they spent $8.6 billion on education in the U.S. over the last 20 years without achieving the expected results. If you'd asked us 20 years ago, we would have guessed that global health would be our foundation's riskiest work, and our U.S. education work would be our surest bet. In fact, it has turned out just the opposite. In global health, there's a lot of evidence that the world is on the right path, like the dramatic decline in childhood deaths. When it comes to U.S. education, though, we're not yet seeing the kind of bottom line impact we expected. The failure of the Gates Foundation initiative shouldn't come as that big of a surprise, given the findings of an often cited 2002 paper by the Hoover Institute's Eric Hanushek titled "The Failure of Input-Based Schooling Policies." This is an extremely detailed paper which ultimately concluded that the amount of funding a school receives does not correlate very strongly with the achievements, as we've already seen. It also found that, contrary to a popular belief, the teacher-to-student ratio was not as important as some people would have you believe. In other words, the idea that smaller classrooms result in higher test scores for the students is not what Hanushek found in his analysis. One thing that Hanushek found did correlate with student achievement was teacher quality. But teacher quality is another thing that doesn't correlate with funding as strongly as you might think. One of the policy recommendations Hanushek made was that teachers should be compensated based on their performance. In other words, if your students do well, you get paid more. But this type of incentive-based policy doesn't seem to be very popular. And what we see happening seems to be more and more the exact opposite. In fact, there was an article posted in the LA Times yesterday with the headline, "Faced with soaring D's and F's, schools are ditching the old way of grading," which says traditional grading has often been used to justify and to provide unequal educational opportunities based on a student's race or class. By continuing to use century-old grading practices, we inadvertently perpetuate achievement and opportunity gaps, rewarding our most privileged students and punishing those who are not. It looks like if Hanushek has been waiting for vindication on the proposals he made 20 years ago, he's going to have to keep waiting for now. Meanwhile, liberal pundits and progressives continue to cite lack of funding as the reason for achievement disparities. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out there have been a few studies over the last decade that purport to show that increased funding actually does produce results. Personally, I tend to be skeptical from what I've seen. The effect size is often not that impressive, and the studies themselves are always localized rather than looking at things on a national, much less global scale or doing a meta-analysis. But of these studies, one that found the most impressive results is a 2017 paper titled "Court-Ordered Finance Reforms in the Adequacy Era, Heterogeneous Causal Effects and Sensitivity." And what they found in this study is that a 11 to 12% increase in per pupil spending resulted in a 7 to 12% increase in graduation rates. Now, it's possible that there's all kinds of methodological flaws in this study, but what if we just accept it at face value? What would that actually mean? What would the cost then be to eliminate the achievement gap between black and white students? Well, that's not a question I can give you a precise answer to, but I can give you a rough idea thanks to a detailed 2019 report done by the University of Ohio titled "Taking Measure of Ohio's Adequacy Gap in School Funding." This is a very dense report, and so I'm going to try to give you just the key takeaways. But essentially, the first thing they did is break down the various schools in Ohio based on a performance index, and they set 60% or a D grade as what they considered adequate. They then proceeded to try to answer the question, how much funding would be required to take all the students who were below the adequacy level, below that passing D grade, and raise them just up to that D level. Now, before I tell you the figure they come up with, I do want to make a note that they mentioned multiple times in the report that all of their analysis found that demographics had a stronger effect on a school's performance index than the amount of funding that the school receives. I won't elaborate on that any further, as I'm sure we probably all know what that means. Ultimately, what they found is that the average funding needed would be $32,250 per pupil, or $10.6 billion a year, a figure that they call certainly not feasible. They're also quick to point out that the real number would probably be much greater than that due to the economic law of diminishing returns. In other words, that figure is based off of the 2017 study I just showed you, but what they're saying is that there's no reason reason to believe you can take the results of that study and just scale them up forever. In other words, every additional 10% increase you make in the funding is likely to produce a smaller increase in the graduation rates than the previous 10%. So let's just take a minute to marinate in this and think about what it means. Well, first of all, Ohio isn't the whitest state in America. It's not in the top 10, but it is in the top 20. So if you imagine the same analysis being done in a place like California or New York, the number would be even more astronomical because, as we know, demographics are the most important factor in a school's performance index. But again, you have to keep in mind this figure, this extra $10 billion in funding per year, is not designed to eliminate the achievement gap between white students and black students. It's designed to take all of the failing students and get them up to a passing grade. The cost of eliminating the achievement gap would be much greater still. And that's what progressives are demanding that we do, right? People like Ibram Kendi insist that America will always be a racist, white supremacist nation until those achievement gaps are completely eliminated. Now, we already know based off of part 1 of this series that white students don't receive more funding for their education than black students do. But if the goalpost is moved from the funding has to be fair and equal to the funding has to be so equitable that the achievement gap is reduced, then it needs to be understood that we're talking about a dollar amount that is so astronomical that it could only be described as ludicrous. And I really think it would be fair for white people who are being asked to shoulder the majority of that tax burden to just say, no, this is not reasonable. This is too much. You're asking for too much. This pipe dream you have of eliminating the achievement gap is one you're just going to have to let go of. Now, I want to be clear about something here, which is that I'm not against kids getting a good education. I'm not diametrically opposed to funding our public schools. I don't like paying taxes any more than the next guy, but seeing those tax dollars go into children's educations is honestly one of the less egregious uses that the government is able to find for my money. So the issue isn't really just me sitting here being like, fuck them kids. It's more that I'm very skeptical of the ability of that money to produce the kind of results that people are demanding that it produces. And so as the final thing I'll leave you with to illustrate this point is to tell you about an experiment that was done in Kansas City, Missouri, when a judge back in 1985 ordered that the state spend an extra $2 billion in a single underperforming district to bring it up to snuff. This worked out to more than $40,000 per student, even more than the amount that was suggested by the Ohio report. But this experiment, which ran for 2 decades, didn't produce the desired results. In fact, the dropout rate remained at about an abysmal 60% for Kansas City, while attendance rates actually went down. And student performance on standardized tests have shown no measurable improvements. This experiment has been written about quite a lot, with a lot of people trying to figure out why it was such an abysmal failure. For example, in a report by the Cato Institute, they theorized that one of the major flaws was not getting rid of the bad teachers, writing that the school district was as much a jobs program as an educational institution. In other words, these public sector jobs are a way to lower the black unemployment rate, raise the black median income, so there was no performance-based incentives, there was no accountability, and teachers who didn't produce results in their students were allowed to stay on ad nauseum. But at the end of the day, I think it just goes to prove what we showed at the start of the video, which is that funding just doesn't work. This just doesn't work. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at a school if the students aren't showing up, having an eagerness to learn. So any progressives whining and whinging about more school funding should be shown this Kansas City experiment and made to answer and explain it. Of course, I fear their answer would be the most predictable thing, as pointed out by Thomas Sowell in my Thug Life video, which is that any time these progressive experiments fail, they always have the same answer.
No, but it's fascinating that you see. I see this happening in all sorts of issues, from Federal Reserve policies on across the board. That you say, here's this wonderful program, and it will do wonderful things, and the burden of proof is on others to show that it will not do those things. And no matter how long it's been going on,
it's not long enough.
It's never long enough. If it failed, there just wasn't enough commitment. The budget wasn't big enough. Should have had a larger staff, wider powers. But there is never any sense of a burden of proof on you to say, when you've made this change that has caused such furor in this country and has gotten people at each other's throats, including people who have been allies in the past, such as blacks and the Jews, there is never any sense of a need for you to advance the empirical evidence to support what you've been doing.
Oh, on the contrary, Dr. Sal, I'm perfectly willing to have other people collect the empirical evidence. That's not my bag.
All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all on the flip side. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think of this video down in the comments. Of course, videos like this take a lot of work. I don't know why I do them. It's like I'm giving myself homework, like I'm assigning myself a report. I have to sit down, do research, make like a fucking bibliography. Why do I do this? I don't know. But if you enjoy it, if you want to see more of this type of content, the best thing you can do is sign up for a pledge on Patreon or Subscribestar, or join a YouTube membership, because those recurring pledges really tell me that people have my back and want to see more of this content down the road. Of course, I won't say no to a one-time donation either. And if you are a broke ass fool, there's other things you can do to help. Share the video, send this video to somebody who might like it, because you know YouTube's not boosting me up in the algorithm. So I really appreciate that. Thanks again, fam, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace out.
Inequality in the nature of political participation, all those things are mitigated by equalizing the skills that education produces, not only the academic skills, but the dispositions, the frames of minds, the conscientiousness, the diligence, the sense of agency. And so I think there is nothing more important we could do to produce the type of society we want than to raise outcomes in the field of education, so that knowing somebody's race or ethnicity tells you nothing at all about what their test scores or grades or occupation might be.